The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
There's no better feeling than a personal win, and the State Farm Personal Price Plan can help you do just that. Talk to a State Farm agent today to learn how you can bundle and save with the Personal Price Plan. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is a super special episode. It's a very special episode. I'm sharing an interview with author Shelley Puhak, the author of the book The Dark Queens, joint biography of Fredegund and Brunhilde, who you will know from the super special episodes from last summer. And I was able to do those episodes because I was fortunate enough to get a pre-publication advance reader copy of this book, so I can attest that it's so good. It was really exciting to talk to Shelley all about everything Fredegund and Brunhilde and how she wrote the book, so please enjoy. Okay, so I'm joined by Shelley Puhak. Welcome, Shelley. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So you have a book coming out that's about, well, at least one person who the listening audience are very familiar with, but it's equally about someone else. Can you tell, just introduce your book, just in case somebody doesn't know who you are and what your book is?
Yes. So my book is The Dark Queens, and the subtitle is The Bloody Rivalry That Forged the Medieval World. And it is the long suppressed history of two early medieval queens, Fredegund, who you and your listeners are very familiar with, and her arch nemesis, Brunhilde.
And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but your previous books have been poetry, right? That you've published?
Have. Mm-hmm.
So how did you wind up writing this very specific history book about these two obscure figures?
That's a great question. So I do write some nonfiction, mainly articles and essays, but this is my nonfiction debut. And when I stumbled across these queens' stories, I was actually working on a completely different project. And as part of that project, I was participating in this thing called a genographic project, which is like trying to trace deep ancestry. So it's not necessarily like ancestry.com, but it was trying to work out who your earliest genetic maternal ancestors were. And I was oddly enough linked to this Viking queen named Estrid, and then to her mother, who's the semi-legendary Sigrid the Haughty, who I think you and your listeners, if you are not familiar with her story, will be very excited about. So all you really need to know about Sigrid is that the King of Norway slaps her across the face during marriage negotiations. Sigrid tells him he'll be sorry. She spends the next decade organizing a multinational alliance. She ambushes him at sea. She forces him to commit suicide by jumping into the icy waters while she watches and waves from her own boat. So I thought that was the story, which is pretty cool, that I was going to be writing. And then in the course of that, I come across a source that makes this like offhand mention that if you think the grudge match between Sigrid and the King of Norway is bad, you should really look at the grudge match between Queen Brunhilde and Queen Fredegund. And I had never heard of either of these queens, but clearly immediately I am very curious. And at the same time, as I describe in the opening of my book, I also happened to buy one of those Viking hats at a costume store for a Halloween party. It was one of those like giant plastic horned helmets with the blonde braids glued on. I must have had Vikings on the brain because of Sigrid the Haughty, but I also knew like this helmet was linked in some way to a woman in an opera named Brunhilde. And then I realized there was a connection to the story of Fredegund and Brunhilde, and I was hooked, and I kind of fell down the research rabbit hole, and this book resulted.
Okay, the research rabbit hole is a big thing that I'm really curious about because, okay, my listeners know, but just to recap, somebody mentioned to me, oh, you should do an episode about Fredegund, and then I just like Googled it. I found the Wikipedia page. I'm like, whoa, this is interesting. And then I was like, I wish that there was a biography of her. And then I came across one of your articles. And at the bottom of the article it said like she's writing a book about this. And I'm like, oh my God, like what perfect timing. So like there wasn't a book about this until your book. So like the research, like you are kind of the first person to like delve this deep into it. So how did you find the information you found?
So, as you well know, is the case with probably every historical woman that you have done any episode on. Basically, all we know about them is through some man.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to sift through all of that, figure out who each man was, what his agenda was, what could he possibly realistically know and not know, and how much credence to give to his account. And the bibliography in this book is quite ridiculous. I think it's like 20 pages. So there's a lot, but I'm happy to share some of my favorite highlights of these men and the Queen's lives. So
can I ask one question first? So like when you're doing
Sure.
this research, were you looking at primary source documents, like
Yes.
things written, like is Frankish a written language? Like
It's all in Latin.
oh, okay.
So they were writing in Latin. And then luckily my Latin is quite terrible. I had to, in many cases, rely on a translator, but luckily a lot of these have already been translated for me. But
Okay.
a lot of times I went back to the original Latin and then kind of double checked, because there were some really interesting things where there were words that, particularly like when it applied to Fredegund, where you're like, is she mad? Is she scared? Is she upset? And the shade of meaning of that word could really change something, particularly when it came to things like a pregnancy, a miscarriage, the loss of a child, and certain motivations that men had said, oh, well, clearly they were feeling X, Y, or Z. And then you went back and said, well, actually, it seems more likely, given all of the other evidence, that this was what was really happening. So primary sources, but also a lot of secondary scholarship. There are a very committed group of scholars that specialize in Merovingian history. And I was lucky to get to talk and interact with a lot of them. And there's one in particular who has done a lot of work on Merovingian women named E.T. Daly, who I can give a little shout out to. So if people are really interested in scholarship on this era, that's a good person's work to check out.
So were you in France? Like where are these documents housed? Are we able to do it digitally or?
So I did actually do a lot of traveling. This was pre-pandemic. So this was in 2019, right before everything shut down. I had no idea how lucky I was. But most of these they are digitized. So you can look at the manuscripts online. And then a lot of them that have been translated are in academic libraries. So it is possible to get a copy. I was really lucky to have some kindly librarians sort of bend over backwards to get me these really obscure texts through interlibrary loans that were like very convoluted, but I was extraordinarily like fortunate that way.
Mm-hmm. I think you're going to say, before I ask a question, like what some of your favorite sources were. So what out of the like 20 pages of references, Like, what were the ones that you were most excited about or were most interesting?
I think we get most of our dialogue from a guy named Gregory of Tours. He's kind of a fun source because he really hates women in power, but he's Brunhilde's ally and he's really embarrassed that Brunhilde helped to get him his job as bishop. So he actually like never mentions that she gets him his job, and we only find this out by a mention from one of his friends, and then you go, oh, okay. But he really goes after Fredegund, though. She basically enrages him, and he is very, we could say, a very anti-Fredegund source. But he is also an eyewitness. So, particularly for things like weather events or what happened in what order, we can definitely count on him. And he actually goes on trial for slandering Fredegund and, you know, has his life hanging in the balance and has to pull in some friends and flatter her. So, it is pretty interesting that he's actually involved in it. He has this friend named Fortunatus, who's a court poet who makes his living writing poems for rich people. So he's friends with basically anyone who's anyone in the Frankish kingdoms on both sides. But he writes poems for both Brunhilde and for Fredegund. And what's really interesting is obviously they're biased, but you get a sense of how these women want to be seen. And one thing I found really interesting was even well before Fredegund was regent, the poem he writes about her, it talks about her brains, just how smart she is. And that's not really typical for the time period. It's just she's shrewd, she's great at making decisions. And it also says that she shares in the rule with the king. It's really interesting that publicly they're going out saying the king needs this woman to help him rule, and that's okay. Everyone's all right with that. So I found
Mm-hmm.
that a little surprising and interesting. And
You
then
meant
there are some, oh, go ahead.
no, no, you go ahead.
There are some letters written by Brunhilde and her son that are a lot of fun. Like there's one of these where the Byzantine emperor sends a message to Brunhilde's son and she writes back really sternly and she basically slaps him down and says, I'm the one you need to be dealing with. And he does deal with her from then on. So it is great to get these little glimpses of their personalities. And then there's a lot of more boring and bureaucratic things like church records and church councils and historical chronicles. But those would probably be my favorite.
I'm so excited just thinking that you got to read an actual letter Brunhilde wrote. That's so exciting.
Yeah. She's very imperious and she refers to herself in the royal we. So we have counseled, you know, war, or we have decided this or that. It's kind of fun.
So I was just going to ask before, you mentioned in the Gregory of Tours that he talked about weather events and things. So the weather was wild.
Right? Yes.
Like there, it was just like, what, like describe the weather of the story. It's just like there's all these people making, you know, assassination attempts and like wars and whatever, but it's like, and also guess what? It's like raining for like 10 years or something. Like what was going on?
Yeah. Well, we have, they're both born right after this horrific climate change, and it's 2 degrees, except in our case, we're worried about it becoming 2 degrees warmer. In their case, it went 2 degrees colder, and that disrupts everything. So we have 18 months of darkness, there's snow in the summer. I mean, this is the entire world, right? And then it seems like it takes a while for things to get back up to speed. And then there's another volcanic eruption, and we have more famine. And on top of that, we have bubonic plague. And then it seems like the world rebounds by just, there's a lot of rain. There's just a ton of rain. It's a really wet, damp period. And you can imagine that doesn't bode well for everyone's health, as in there's just constant flooding. Everybody's getting dysentery from the flood water. There's, you know, just cold and damp, a lot of mold. It's really awful. Mud everywhere, right?
Yeah. So just as that as like the backdrop for everything that's happening, like it's just like it feels like a movie. Honestly, it's just like everything simultaneous. Like it's giving me Game of Thrones, right? Where it's just like, well, it's been winter for 20 years and everyone's kind of losing their mind. Yeah. So just that dysentery you mentioned. So that was just like in going through like just reading the book. It's just like, and then this child died of dysentery, and then she like managed to get pregnant again, and then that child died of dysentery, and it's just like, oh my god, it's like unrelenting. Like it seemed to be a lot of children dying.
Yes. And I think unrelenting is a great adjective for it. It's just one thing after another. I don't know how people manage to endure. It's quite overwhelming. And the thing that's so interesting is that there was this knowledge that you should really boil water and you should only drink clean water. And, they were some aqueducts, Roman aqueducts, that were still functioning. So there was this knowledge, but somehow it wasn't always translating into practice. There was just so much chaos in terms of being able to repair infrastructure that they couldn't keep up. So that's the other frustrating thing of if people weren't completely ignorant as to why this was happening, but they just couldn't stop it from happening. And I think that's even more frustrating, must be, to live through.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, if you're just like constantly dealing with like climate-based disasters, it's like, yeah, there's not time to really do the like next level city building structuring type stuff. There's a part, now I'm just like, I read this like a bit ago, but what was this? There's part of it, and I think it was Brunhilde, or no, maybe it's Fredegund. There was a part where like it was something about there was a child was sick, and they were like, yeah, we should all separate everybody. And they're like, no, let's all go in church all together and stay awake for like 72 hours all together.
Yes,
What was that? Can you tell that part?
that's King Guntram, and it's to deal with the plague. And he decides, so some people are saying, having basically rudimentary travel restrictions, like we really shouldn't travel, we should stay apart, and they're understanding that it's how it spreads. So even Gregory of Tours, who's very superstitious, sort of credulous man who believes that, like, stars and comets are causing people to drop dead, but he understands, oh, a ship comes into port, somebody on the ship has the plague, the next thing you know, the people who did business with that man have the plague, and then his family has the plague, and then their neighbors have the plague. So they were understanding how it spread. And a lot of people are saying we should not have fairs, we should not get together. But King Guntram's like, I need a win, so I'm going to make everybody come together for several days, and we're all going to be packed in, and we're just going to pray and have these processions. And all these people drop dead, but not seeing the connection. And then there's this great cure where they decide that some woman takes a bit of thread, or maybe it's embroidery, from his cape and puts it in some water and has her child drink it, and that cures him. So people are starting to think that if they can just get pieces of royal cloaks and soak them in water, that will cure the plague. So scary.
It's so like this story, especially, but I guess lately, anytime I'm reading about somebody living through any sort of pandemic, I'm just like, I relate. But it's so, yeah, because I think there's this really, and I think this comes across really well in your book. There's a sense, like you sort of spoke to it, that people think like, oh, people in those like early medieval period, like, well, they were just a bunch of dum-dums. Like they didn't know what they were doing. Like they were just kind of like in this, the dark ages sort of thing, where it's like, no, like even if they didn't know like germ theory, like they could figure out like a ship comes and then that's where the plague comes from. Like they were smart. I liked reading about how they were making decisions that are similar to decisions people would be making today. Like they're not just like fools who are just like everything's witchcraft or whatever. It's like they're like, I don't know. Did you find like relatable things that people were doing when you were researching it? Like decisions that surprised you that felt like modern?
Yeah, I mean, I think even Fredegund has this one decision where she wants to get rid of one of her stepson, her only surviving stepson, who's in the way between her sons and the throne. And so she sends him to an area that's having an outbreak, comes up with an excuse, because she clearly, there's some understanding, as you say, maybe not of germ theory, but like this area, more people are dying. I'm going to send him here in the hopes that he will die, which is diabolical, but also seems like something somebody could pull off today, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think even just some of the decisions the both queens make surrounding pregnancy, early childhood of their children, even the degree of their grief seems really modern. When you hear of Fredegund being just devastated and she's sobbing publicly, particularly given what we know of her sort of imperious temperament, the fact that she's just that broken, and Fortunatus, this court poet, has to make these poems to say, please stop crying, and there's going to be another son, and you're going to get to snuggle him. And the fact that they would use a word about, like, talk about snuggling and cuddling children, even if it's a stretch, it still gives you a sense of how close people were or expected to be to their children and how
Mhm.
devastated they were when they died so much more frequently than what we have to endure. And that felt very modern too.
Yeah, I think there's sort of this there's a lot of there was so much more child death in history than there is now for various reasons. So I think there's sort of like a flippancy that not just historians, but just like people who read about it, they're like, oh yeah, everyone had 12 children because they knew like five of them would die and whatever. It's like, oh, another child died, like on we go. But it's like, no, like of course people were upset when their children died. Like it's not just like, well, there goes another one. I guess we'll just have another baby.
Yeah, and I'm even thinking of things like postpartum depression that it seems pretty clear based on the evidence that Fredegund has a really bad bout of that, and they describe it even though they don't use the sort of terms that we would. But there are things like that that seem really modern. I also think there's this great interlude where we get to this rebellion in a convent, but there's that description of both surgery, where men are having surgery on their testicles based on some procedure they saw done in Byzantium. So you're saying, okay, so people are able to transport medical knowledge across these distances and copy. And at least in this case, this person survives. We don't know how many people survive, but we have at least a few people where it's successful. So they're performing some sort of basic rudimentary successful surgery. But also there are a lot of cases of people who are biologically sexed as male, but are living as women. So there's like graves that have been found. There's this one particular case of this person who was born a man but lives as a woman in a convent. And so that's also, I think, their sense of gender surprised me often, that it was a little more fluid than we might expect, where we typically think it was black or white, and that they did have some gray area as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was not an era that I've ever read about before. This, like, I've read about, like the Romans, and I've read about, I don't know, like my historical knowledge until I read your book was kind of like Romans, Egyptians, and it jumps forward to like the Renaissance, like what happened in Europe in the middle. And I guess is it because there's just less sources that people know not as much about this time period? Or was it just because they were wiped out and then, well, I guess I know like Charlemagne came in and then like about that, but the stuff that happened before, was it suppressed?
I think it's twofold. So there's been this estimate that of the sources that survive, there are probably less than 1% of what was produced. But because so little survived, it became really easy for the next dynasty to say these people were idiots. They didn't produce a lot of information, and look how smart we are in comparison to them. So there was a bit of a public relations campaign on the part of Charlemagne and his dynasty. But also, the Merovingians made a bad decision. They didn't know it at the time, to use papyrus for a lot of their records. And papyrus can survive for thousands and thousands of years in the dry climate of Egypt. But once you get it into the damp and the cold of Europe, it does not last nearly as long. So a lot of what has survived just happened to be on parchment. And there was a papyrus shortage. And there were these issues with trade. So people switched to parchment. And so it just happened that everybody who wrote on parchment, those records survived, and all the records that had been written on papyrus didn't. And that's just kind of the luck of the draw. So some of that accounts for the lack of sources. And then also there was a lot of purposeful suppression as well.
Which leads me to something that I still find it very, I wouldn't say enraging, but just like so annoying, which is that after the death of both women, that it was kind of like she was the king's mother, the end. Like the fact that it's Fredegund's tomb, right? That's just like wife, mother, and it's like, oh my God, she did so much. Like it was her, like immediately, like upon the death of both women, like what they did was kind of hidden away. Like sort of like we kind of don't want people to know that like women did stuff, so let's just like not let anyone know what happened.
Absolutely. And something that really surprised me is I assumed that Brunhilde and Fredegund were exceptions to the rule. And I was really surprised to find out that there were actually quite a few female political leaders in the 6th century. So if your listeners are interested, we have a queen in Lombard, Italy. There's a regent, Sophia, for the Byzantine Empire. Japan's being ruled by an empress, Suiko. There's a Mayan queen name's Jarl Icknall. And so we have all these women that happen to be ruling at the same time. And then we also have women that are powerful abbesses and business owners, and women who are entangled in political plots. And we have nuns in armed rebellions. So given how few sources survive, I think we only know the half of it. But it's really surprising that there were so many women in such a chaotic era that were thriving, not just surviving and getting by, but actually thriving and ruling.
Mm-hmm. And then that sort of stuff is so interesting to me too, because there's such a, it's sort of like, I don't know, the common way that history is taught in general. It's kind of like, women weren't able to do anything. And then suddenly, like the 1960s, birth control pill, women could have jobs now, where it's like, no, it's not been like an upward trajectory and like women get more and more rights. It's like there were places like this where that was not so much of an issue. And then that was suppressed. And then this other place, like I love reading with these little pockets of time to learn that like history is not a straight line of just like things are just always getting better, which is so false. But especially in terms of women's rights, that's so fascinating. I've just been reading about a woman in 10th century Kashmir and how she was like, anyway, which was really interesting. Like she ruled, it was chaotic there. And then she came in with like a very ruthless, successful style. And then she like brought stability for 40 years to this region.
Fascinating. Wow.
Yeah, no, I know. So it's like, it's not new, the idea of like women could be leaders, but you just don't hear about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you just one final question, which is what influence do you think the Fredegund and Brunhilde had on history, or just like, well, I guess more on a micro level, like the development of Western Europe? Like, what do you think their era, what's the significance of it?
So I think there probably are three key ways that they influence Western Europe. So the first and probably the most obvious is one provides the air and the other the land that shapes Europe for the next few centuries. So Fredegund is the one through who, her blood flows through all the subsequent Merovingian kings. And I say that just because there were some questions about her son's legitimacy. These might have been the usual slurs, but because we have no DNA, we can't prove paternity. So she's the only one we can really be certain of. And anyone who follows is her descendant. And there are even people alive today, they call themselves the Order of the Merovingian Dynasty, who claim to be descended from Fredegund. So they trace their lineage back through a woman named Bertha Broadfoot, who is Charlemagne's mother, who may have been part of the Merovingian royal family, kind of tangentially. So there is that sort of intriguing bit that if it's not for Fredegund, we don't have the rest of the dynasty. And then obviously Brunhilde and Fredegund to an extent provide the land. So when Fredegund's son, Clothar II, deposes her, he's getting a ready-made empire. He's moving in. She's already united the bulk of Western Europe, for him. We know that they have an outside influence on future queens. So there are women who try to follow in their footsteps or take lessons from them, and we know are aware of their example. So there's women who try to become regents themselves, or they adopt some of their survival tactics. And there's even a great case, this Queen Adelaide of Maurienne, who has a matching sarcophagus made, like her. So her and Fredegund have matching, or matchy, even after death. So we know that a lot of royal French women read their stories, are aware of their legacy, and we can assume there's some influence there. But I think the most important is that the backlash to their reigns like reverberates, and it really impacts Europe for centuries. I would argue that it sets the world back in a lot of ways. Both of these women seem to foresee the wisdom of there being a single heir model. They're both trying to consolidate it behind a single male heir, as opposed to keep dividing it up. As we know that probably would have worked out a little bit better and prevented, some wars if that had worked. But we also know that like when Brunhilde is betrayed by the people who work for her and Clothar II, Fredegund's son, moves in, he basically dooms the whole dynasty because he has to make some concessions. So in order to get what he wants, and part of that is he limits the king's power and he agrees to split the Frankish empires into three. So it basically does away with the dream of like a unified empire like Rome, and it leads to the fragmented nation states that we see then for the next, 1,000 years. So there's kind of two models of government where we could have this sort of Roman Empire with these sort of semi-autonomous provinces, or we could have these sort of fragmented kingdoms that are always going to be jockeying for position and a lot of infighting. So they also, both of them stand up to the church at a time when the church is consolidating power and it's growing increasingly misogynistic and more fundamentalist. So they're on the losing side of that. But unfortunately, the way the church reacts to both of them influences women for centuries. So we have to keep in mind at about a generation before them, women are still serving as deacons. So they're actually participating in mass. That has to be outlawed. Priests are still getting married. Things are a lot more in flux, and there's two denominations of Christianity, and it's kind of not clear which one's going to win out, whether it's going to be the more tolerant branch or if it's going to be what eventually becomes Catholicism. We know Fredegund seems to be what I'd say a flexible Christian. There's potentially some pagan influences there. And Brunhilde certainly was raised in a more tolerant Christian background. She's very tolerant of Jews in her kingdom, and she is like smacked down by the Pope for that. So we know that they have this more cosmopolitan worldview, maybe not because they're nice people, but just out of sheer necessity that they have to work with whoever will have them. But we also see like Fredegund clearly assassinating bishops, and Brunhilde brings a rape case against another bishop and, sticks up to some particularly fundamentalist monks and kicks them out of her kingdom. So they unfortunately don't win out, but I think they're part of that struggle where it could have gone either way. And the fact that it goes against them, we essentially pay the price.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually have a question for you, if that's okay.
Please, yeah.
Or maybe two. So you are clearly Team Fredegund. And by the way, I love your That's So Fredegund merch. And I have to tell you, I just ordered a tote.
No, I love it. Okay.
But I also am like really curious, what caught your imagination other than maybe the red hair?
Okay, that is a factor. But I think it was honestly because I had asked my listeners, I was just like, what are some interesting stories? Like, what are some lessons? And one of the listeners said Fredegund. And I'm like, well, who's that? And I Googled it. So I read about Fredegund first. So I came to this all from a Fredegund lens. So I was just like, who's Fredegund? And then, excuse me, Brunhilde. I'm like, oh, that's Fredegund's enemy. Like, that was how I didn't make the choice after seeing them both and assessing. It was just kind of like I came to it from a Fredegund point of view. And from her point of view, Brunhilde is the enemy. And that was just kind of where I came to it from. But Brunhilde, I do think one day I might do a Brunhilde episode, just like flip it around to be like from her point of view, what was happening. But I don't know. Also, Fredegund feels kind of like the underdog to me a bit. And the way that she kept trying to assassinate Brunhilde and it kept not working was like, made me like her more. It was like charming. And then the fact that her military victories were so stylish, like the walking forest, it's like that was her. It's just, I don't know. So it's Fredegund has a sort of, I think because she wasn't, as my sense is, not as powerful as Brunhilde, so she was like scrappier. And also the fact that she came from being like an enslaved person to being so powerful, where Brunhilde kind of she was like more groomed for it. So yeah, so I think it's the underdog quality I appreciate, and also just her flair.
Her flair. Do you have a favorite Fredegund story?
I love so many things about Fredegund. When I was getting ready for this interview, I was just like, remember when she did this? And I was just like, oh, she did so many cool things. I was like looking at my notes from when I was doing the episode. I love the walking trees. I love that she kind of invented putting poison on blades.
Daggers.
That was iconic. But I mean, the part where, God, I forget what it even was, but when somebody had said that she had maybe committed adultery, and then it's like, well, she could have 12 witnesses speak for her. And she brought in 300, and they were like all like bishops and like the most important people. Like
She's
I
like,
think
bam.
that's the most iconic Fredegund moment for me. I think the 300 character witnesses. Yes.
Excellent.
Although I like one of her military victories. I forget the details exactly, but it's where she got all of her army to like cut their hair so they would look like the other people.
Yes, the Bretons, when she's so she wants to go against Guntram, but she doesn't want to be seen to do so. So she is like, yeah, these the Bretons are fighting against you. So we're just gonna pretend we're Bretons.
Yeah. Well, and where hair was so important to the like culturally, but she's like, what if I just like cut off everyone's hair? And then, yeah. So just like, I'm not someone who's into reading about like battle history, but Fredegund, every time she did one, it was something cool like that that made me interested in it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool. I love hearing that. She is quite a character. And what's so fascinating about both of these women is they never seem to have internalized the misogyny that's all around them. Like there's doesn't seem to be a lot of self-doubt. There might have been, but we don't see it. But they were like, why not? Why can't I?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just as good as the rest of you, if not better. Here I go.
Well, and I think I appreciate that too. I love like not just like as a woman reading about women, but just like as a person. Like I love reading about somebody who's just like that confident and outside the box and like who's in this like pit of vipers environment where like anyone could betray you at any point. But the way that they're both kind of like always one step ahead of that is like gratifying to read. Where they're sort of they are in ostensibly powerful roles, but they could so easily be brought down. And the fact that they weren't was very um not inspirational, but just like satisfying to read, I think.
I think my favorite Fredegund story has to do with Sigebert's assassination, but I just find it amazing that first she has this severe postpartum depression. She basically seems like she might be borderline, psychotic, like she's comatose, and she somehow is able to snap out of that, which in and of itself, right? Everyone else around her is completely freaking out. They're under siege. They assume they're about ready to die. And none of the military advisors or her own husband can figure a way out of it. And she doesn't just recover, she's able to keep a cool head, and she's able to come up with an innovative idea for an assassination and then convince two boys to go on a suicide mission for her. I just can't imagine the wherewithal, especially on days when I can't get my grocery list together. And she was able to pull all of that off in such a short period of time. It's just stunning.
I love that. I love that story too. I love just the image of just like everyone being chaotic around her and she's just like pulls herself even just momentarily to be like, okay, like clearly you can't do anything without me, like here's what we're gonna do, like we're good, and then she can just like go back into her coma or whatever, like the yeah, just the constant really smart things she did. And because you're more objective about all of this than I am, what's a Brunhilde iconic moment that you really like?
I do like when Brunhilde goes after the church occasionally. I also love that she cooperates. I didn't know this story, but Pope Gregory the Great happens to be somewhat progressive in that he's willing to work with women because nobody else seems to really want to work with him. And I love part of this idea that Bede erases from his history, but that Pope Gregory the Great thanks her and says, you're the reason that Britain is Christianized, and that she's the one funding his missionary movement to send the monks over to Canterbury in the little kingdom of Kent and essentially convert all of those people. So that was just something that I find really interesting, that that's like an outsized influence that we don't know about, that's kind of been erased. I love her letters, particularly there's a few where there's one in particular where her grandson is being held hostage by the Byzantines and they're trying to get her to go to war in order to get him back. And she writes these letters to the Byzantine empress saying, essentially, part of her plays on her pity, like, oh, feel bad for me. I miss my grandson and he's my only link to my dead daughter and I'm just so sad. But then a minute later there's that steel, and like it would be very unfortunate if something were to happen to you know to your son who's about the same age as my grandson. So you might want to keep that in mind, and how she's able to kind of veer back and forth. So anytime I think that she maybe has lost the plot and she's genuinely upset, and then you realize, nope, she's thought this all out ahead of time. I also really love about Brunhilde how she builds these networks with other women. So as much as we have the two of them fighting against one another, there was some part of it that was kind of charming for me to realize that it wasn't necessarily personal, because I think it can be really easy to get caught up in the catfight aspect of it, as opposed to, which I like that you focused on, them as political rivals of just somebody's got to win and we've got to do this. But I really like how there's this treaty that she negotiates, and she makes sure throughout the treaty to basically guard the rights of all these other women. So, it's called the Treaty of Andelot, and we know there's cooperation between her, another one of her daughters, her daughter-in-law, as well as Guntram's own daughter. And a third of that treaty just has to do with women. Like Brunhilde gets legal protection for herself. For all of these other women, it says we're financially independent. You can't force us into a convent. We can keep our property. We can dispose of it as we wish. So I really like that about her. And I also love this moment where Brunhilde and Fredegund have to have this short-lived alliance. So there's this time when Fredegund basically has to grudgingly, symbolically adopt Brunhilde's son. And I just love to imagine the behind the scenes of that for both of them, because there had to be some sort of gritting of the teeth and getting on with it. But I also like that really shows their very practical sides, and how in some ways they're more similar than they are different.
I love what you said about like the rights and stuff that Brunhilde was codifying for women and stuff, because one does find in stories where women take power, especially in ones where they're like the regent, but technically the like child boy is the king.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times they're like, oh, I'm just like, a lot of times they like separate from their gender, I think out of survival, but they really don't stand up for other women because they know that wouldn't be popular. I can't think of a specific example, but there's certainly women who have been in power, but they really rule. I would say Elizabeth the First, but they really rule like men, right. Frankly, right? Because that's kind of what they have to do. It's like the way that they can get respect is by being like, oh, I'm not really a woman. Like I look like a woman, but I'm not really a woman. I'm not going to like give like women rights. So I respect that Brunhilde and Fredegund didn't. Well, and like you were saying, the cultural context of the time, it's like that misogyny of religion was not super influential at that point. So they were able to have a bit more leeway, I guess, than what future generations had to deal with. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting, too, to think about how there's this horrific climate change and this pandemic, and those are very bad things, but they also open up a lot of opportunities for women. And I think that that's just something that I am trying to keep in mind, because people are more willing to try something unconventional. I mean, there is a shortage a lot of times of able leaders. We know a lot of the men just keep dying, but there is this sense of, you know what, things are kind of going to hell in a handbasket. Why not? Why not try this? And so there is, I think, a little bit of hope to be found in that, even just in our own time too, that sometimes really extreme circumstances can push us to think out of the box and to maybe allow people who've been marginalized to come to the forefront and to contribute to a greater degree.
Mm-hmm. Your book comes out on February 22nd.
It does, right? Yes. Mm-hmm.
And are you going to, well, this is just a curious question of my own. Like you're going to be doing, I assume, like lots of other interviews, and like you're going to be.
I know that as far as it's a mix of things right now, being virtual and being in person. I know that there is a virtual event on the 27th. I believe it's February 27th, DC's Politics and Prose, but it's a free virtual event for anyone who would like to join. And I know there are some in-person events and a mix of virtual events, but anyone who's interested can certainly check out my website. It's shelleypuhak.com, and that's Shelley with an EY, Puhak.com. And there's an events page, and I am updating that as more and more things get on the schedule. So thank you. And thank you so much for your support of the book. I was so grateful to stumble across this podcast and to hear of your love of all things Fredegund. And I'm very excited to get my tote.
Really, that's honestly, this is like a beautiful full circle moment because I just like found your book, did this podcast, and now you have the tote. It's like, I don't know, it's a circle of life. It's beautiful. So good luck with all of your promotion. And I'm so excited for when the book comes out. And I know like listeners have been telling me like they're excited to get the book. So you'll get a little vulgar history, little bump of purchases, I hope.
Well, thank you. That's so gratifying. It's excellent.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciated chatting with you.
So as we said in the episode, you can get a copy of The Dark Queens all over the place. There are links at Shelley's website, shelleypuhak.com, and I've got the link in the show notes as well. And also check out her website to learn about all of the online events she has coming up, because obviously, as you just listened to, she's a delightful person to listen to. She has so much to say about this book and about these queens. And I'm so happy that I got to share this interview with all of you. Regular episodes of Vulgar History are going to start next week. Season 5 is going to start on March 2nd, so stay tuned for that. And until then, keep your mask on and your tits out. Take care.
Talmor, Sheshin Marachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors, including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I'm the host and creator of Only One in the Room podcast. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's incredible Only One story. We talk to the realest of real people, dealing with issues like infertility, addiction, human trafficking, and body shaming. Oh, and we want to be fair, so we talk to some celebrities too. Oscar winners, New York Times bestselling authors, supermodels, and even the most decorated U.S. Winter Olympian. Everyone is invited to share their Only One story with our listeners. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone. Download Only One in the Room wherever you listen to podcasts today.